Coming up in this episode, we're going to talk about all sorts of pre-rendered and full-motion video adventure games from the 1990s that attempted to move the genre forward, including Myst, The Journeyman Project, the Tex Murphy games, The Seventh Guest, and more. And we'll also hitch a lift aboard the starship Titanic, a game created by Douglas Adams. I'm Sean Jordan, and I am your Great Game Guide. Get ready for a survey of many of the great adventure games you may have played, may have heard of, or may have missed. So before we begin this episode, full disclosure, I sort of hate the game Myst. Okay, I mean, I don't actually hate it the way I hate pineapple on my pizza, because there's nothing really wrong with Myst. It's just never gelled with me as a game, and I don't find it very entertaining or interesting. And I think it's important to mention my bias up front, because we're going to spend some time today talking about video games with pre-rendered environments, full motion video, and sometimes full-on 3D. And like a lot of adventure game fans, I actually prefer the classic pixel art style of early 1990s adventure games to many of these mid to late 90s games. But given that we've already talked about quite a few games that adopted and used these newer styles, let me also explain why I'm not a fan of Myst and many of the games that followed in its wake. They remind me of theme parks. That might sound like a strange comparison, but I've been to quite a few theme parks and the experience is usually the same. I spend a lot of time walking around, looking at things and trying to figure out how to get to those far-off places that look really fun. And then when I finally get there, I still have to find the entrance to the rides and wait in line, often with minimal entertainment along the way. Then I get on the ride, and it's fun for a few minutes, but a lot of the rides have these weird stories that they want to tell, often in very boring and non-interactive ways. When the ride's over, I'm back to looking for someplace else to go and something else to occupy my time. I'd estimate the fun ratio at a theme park is probably 1 fun minute every 20 minutes of drudgery. And it can vary more than that. Sometimes you go on a less busy day and things are better, and sometimes you go on a day when the rides are broken or closed down due to weather and it's worse. There are ways to optimize your fun, and there are also ways to cheat, but all in all, you're spending a lot of time not having fun and a good deal of your time bewildered by stuff that's there to keep you from realizing how bored you are. And to me, that's Myst. It didn't impress me in 1993 because I was playing adventure games like Day of the Tentacle, Sam & Max Hit the Road, Quest for Glory 1, So You Want to Be a Hero, and Space Quest 4, Roger Wilco and the Time Rippers during that time. But Myst was more popular than all of them, and we're going to talk about why in a moment, but let's back up a minute and talk about Myst's developer, Rand and Robin Miller's studio, Cyan, which started out on the Macintosh with the imaginative Alice in Wonderland-style kids adventure, The Manhole, in 1988, before they developed 2 other games called Cosmic Osmo in 1989 and Spelunks and the Caves of Mount Suedo in 1991. We don't need to spend a lot of time talking about either of those games. They're both very similar to The Manhole in that they involve walking around imaginative fantasy lands depicted on static screens and interacting with objects, cartoon characters, and light puzzles and minigames. They provide the template for Myst, but these games are all really geared at children. So, how did Cyan make the jump to more adult-oriented puzzling? As we've discussed before, the Macintosh already had a few games that provided exactly that experience. ICOM Simulation's quadrilogy of Mac Venture games, including both Deja Vu's, Shadowgate, and Uninvited. And the Amiga and Atari ST also had a couple of games in the same vein published by Psygnosis and developed by SARL Infomedia called Explora in France and ChronoQuest everywhere else. There was also a third Explora game, by the way, but it never made it out of France. All of these games were mouse-driven, utilized graphical user interfaces to allow players to interact with the game world, and utilized a first-person perspective that allowed players to move through static screens into different rooms to locate items and puzzles. Cyan's games did a lot of that already because they were built using a tool called HyperCard that allowed the games to showcase full-screen graphical images and then let players click around to interact with things, removing the need for a clunky interface for verbs and inventory items. Their children's games already had a baked-in philosophy of no deaths and no enemies, so they kept that intact as well. Another thing the Millers realized was that they could create pre-rendered graphics and have them display instantaneously and in full color rather than using graphics drawn by the software itself. This created files that were far too big to put in large quantities on diskettes, but With the CD-ROM format, Cyan could include an entire world's worth of pre-rendered still images, plus some full-motion video and high-quality digital audio to help make the world feel more alive and interesting. The only real limitation at the time was that CDs were slow, but there were lots of ways to mask that by compressing files, using lower color bit depth, and ensuring that files needed for areas near the player were loaded into memory before they were reached. The result is a game where you play as an adventurer discovering a book about the mysterious island of Mist, only to get pulled into the world depicted within and to discover it was a trap. And the only way to escape is to explore the island and aid two brothers who communicate with you through books you find early on in the island's library. But these books are missing pages. You eventually have to visit different sections of the world called ages that are self-contained and which each have the missing pages you need, but which also reveal a deeper secret about a green book and a third person who's part of a broader dynasty that ties into the later games. It's all a fun magic trick, and Myst really was a clever game for its time. When you consider that Doom was released the same year and offered a disc-based real-time 3D action game engine that felt like stepping into virtual reality, while Myst used a wildly different multimedia approach that made people feel like they were entering into an entirely open world, you can see why both games became massively influential. And Myst was undisputedly the best-selling computer game of the 1990s, selling over 6 million copies worldwide and becoming one of the strongest arguments for upgrading to a multimedia system. People who didn't like games loved Myst. It was the equivalent of Wordle for the time because it was accessible, fun, and just challenging enough to captivate ordinary people. But does it hold up? It's not my cup of tea, but it's definitely got a huge following. Today we have no shortage of Myst variants to play, including a full 3D and even virtual reality version, as well as a bunch of sequels, spiritual successors, and even a 1996 parody game called Pissed. The direct sequels to Myst ran through 2005 and include Riven, Myst 3 Exile, Myst 4 Revelation, and Myst 5 End of Ages, as well as the 2003 spin-off Uru, Ages Beyond Myst, and Myst Online Uru Live, an MMO game which you can still play today for free if you really want to. Cyan rebranded as Cyan Worlds in the early 2000s and has since produced another Cosmo Osmo game and two crowd-funded adventures called Abduction and Firmament, which are best known for their VR modes, but which are really just sort of variations on the same theme. Myst had some competition at the time, however, a multimedia adventure game by a developer called Trilobite that also used pre-rendered video footage and stills to depict a haunted mansion where a murder mystery could unfold. This game, the 1993 CD-ROM classic The Seventh Guest, also sold millions of copies, and while it was not quite as successful as Myst, it's often regarded, along with Myst, as one of the 3 killer apps that drove PC users to install multimedia upgrades. That third killer app, by the way, Star Wars Rebel Assault, an action game that also shipped in 1993 and sold over 1 million copies, but we'll save it for another time. The Seventh Guest is a game about exploring a haunted mansion where ghostly figures float around and reenact a gathering at the house where something clearly went wrong. Sort of like a game of Clue where everyone wound up getting killed. But the game begins with a surprisingly involved introduction about a ne'er-do-well named Henry Stoff, who starts out as a thief, but begins having strange visions of dolls and toys, which he decides to create and sell. He's rewarded with great wealth and prestige for the things he makes, but some of the children who own his toys start dying. He then sees a vision of a mansion, which he builds out on the edge of town, and he invites 6 people to come for dinner, asking them to bring along a mysterious 7th guest. Who that guest is becomes the basis of the game's peculiar story, and it's very much in that theme park kind of vein where things happen but they're hard to follow until you really dig in and try to understand what exactly is actually happening. Much of the game involves moving from room to room and solving puzzles as Stoff taunts you for some reason, but most of the puzzles aren't that challenging and give you clues that help you to solve them. If you're not invested in the story, and honestly it's so hammy I doubt most people would be, the game's really just an excuse to throw a bunch of archaic and disjointed puzzle minigames at you. But what made The Seventh Guest such a popular game at the time was the presentation, and the game's use of full-screen, full-motion video, and pre-rendered artwork really does elevate the otherwise simple gameplay and give the game the vibe of exploring a place that truly is haunted by ghostly apparitions that show up transparently against the game's environments and relive their traumatic evening over and over. It feels like what 3D first-person action-adventure games would eventually evolve into over time, and if you play more modern titles in the same vein, like Gone Home, Soma, or What Remains of Edith Finch, you'll see how those games share a lot of design sensibilities with The Seventh Guest. Trilobite also released a 1995 sequel called The 11th Hour that continues the story 70 years later with some new visitors to Stoff's mansion, but it's essentially the same design with a far more convoluted story that's also a lot darker in its themes, though with the production values and dialogue of a basic cable movie. Much like Phantasmagoria's sequel, which really ramped up the sex and violence, The 11th Hour attempts to introduce a more mature, R-rated content and play up the horror. The problem is that it's so cheesy and the tone is so jarring that it doesn't land quite as well as Phantasmagoria: A Puzzle of Flesh does. But let's talk about a couple of other series that were also quite prominent in pushing forward the full-motion video style of adventure gaming. The first is a trilogy of games released through 1993, 1995, and 1998 by Presto Studios called the Journeyman Project that take place in a far future setting where the Earth has finally settled down into a peaceful monoculture, and an alien collective called the Symbiotry of Peaceful Beings has invited Earth to join its interplanetary alliance. Unfortunately, the human government is also in possession of a scrapped time machine called Pegasus that someone has used to go back in time and alter human history so they can nix humanity's chances of joining the alliance. As the temporal security agent known throughout the game as Agent 5, you have to travel to several key points in time to stop robots that have been programmed to interfere with humanity's growing acceptance of the aliens' offer. It's a neat science fiction premise, and it's told through a combination of pre-rendered scenes and full-motion video talking head animations, though the game's not nearly as impressive as Myst and has a far more complex interface that takes up much of the screen. The puzzles are also significantly harder to solve, and the original build of the game was so slow and unwieldy that it required some dedication to get through. The second and third game extend this story, but also go a bit broader by sending you back into deeper parts of human history, so you can stop another temporal security agent who's in league with an alien race that's opposed to the Symbiotry of Peaceful Beings. You then move into pure speculative history and investigate mythical cities like Atlantis that have a connection to an even older alien race. And yes, the plot sounds kind of cliche today, but believe it or not, the unfolding story is what drives the Journeyman Project games and keeps them interesting. The villains have really strong motivations behind what they're hoping to accomplish, and the time travel mechanics are decently thought out to ensure that considerable plot holes inherent to the genre aren't a problem here. If you can put up with limitations of these games, particularly the first one, the Journeyman Project is a great series to dive into. Just be warned that each game is longer than the last, and you'll spend as much time on the third game as the first two combined. Unfortunately, those are really the only games I'd recommend from Presto Studios aside from Myst 3 Exile, which they released in 2001 before they shut down in 2002. During the 1990s, they also released a Mobile Suit Gundam interactive movie, a sequel game to the feature film Star Trek Insurrection called Star Trek Hidden Evil, and a minigame collection called Stephen King's F-13, all of which are pretty awful. Speaking of awful games, let's go ahead and rip off the Band-Aid and talk about Activision's foray into full-motion video adventure games with 1993's Return to Zork. And I'm going to be frank here and say that I despise this game and its entire premise. So here's the thing about Return to Zork. What we should have gotten was a game that attempted to revisit and visualize the familiar environment of the great underground empire, perhaps with some new twists to keep things fresh, similar to the way Super Metroid took the original game and then added quite a bit more to it in order to build on the experience. Instead, this game starts off with an introductory video at the boarded-up house from the original Zork and has you open up the mailbox so you can find an orb in which a man appears and tells you that you've won a sweepstakes prize to visit the Valley of the Sparrows. But as the man starts shouting as if something bad is happening to him off screen, you don't even get to see if it was a Gru or something far worse. The game teleports you away to a place now called the Valley of the Vultures, and you wind up exploring a town called Shanbar, which is being threatened by an evil presence named Morpheus that's brought vultures and trolls to the area, turned a bunch of people into statues, and given everyone else nightmares. You have to spend a good chunk of the game above ground, talking to local residents who exist in a modern-day setting. You eventually learn how to play a board game called Survivor, and also have to take pictures of things with your camera or persuade NPCs to trust you using a dialogue system that allows you to set your tone. At which point, any Zork fan is probably just going to raise an eyebrow and say, "Huh?" because this is very out of line with the previous two trilogies, as well as Zork Zero and Beyond Zork, the Coconut of Quindor. It's pretty telling that none of the original creators worked on this game because it doesn't look, feel, or play like any of the classic Zork text-based adventures. One of the things that aggravates me most about Return to Zork is how cheesy and poorly designed it all looks. The interface is a mixture of illustrated icons and digitized pictures, and the full motion video is inconsistent, flipping between moving rendered scenes and digitized photographs of actors whose mouths and eyes will move as they speak, but who otherwise stand still. Except for when the designers decided to film them moving, which is, again, quite inconsistent. The film sequences are really amateurish and make no attempt to use practical effects beyond some light makeup and local theater-grade costumes. If your idea of a fairy is a woman in a yellow dress with a transparent blue cape hanging off her shoulders for wings, or if your idea of a troll is a guy with a poofy glam rock haircut and a necklace made out of pointy teeth, well, have I got a game for you. Zork Nemesis, The Forbidden Lands, came out in 1996, and it's a far better game in terms of visual design and interface. It's a prequel to Return to Zork, so it feels a little more like the fantasy setting of the original game, and its story involves trying to locate 4 alchemists, one for each element, and stopping the demon Nemesis from gaining access to a 5th element called the Quintessence. The acting and filming is way better this time around, and the pre-rendered scenes are even better than those in Myst, and you can even pan around a full 360 degrees in some places. Unfortunately, this is also one of the game's weaknesses, as it creates a 3-dimensionality that hasn't quite worked out all the problems that later true 3D games would have to figure out. The biggest of which is how to help players to know where to look and what they need to do to progress. There's also the problem of some obvious production woes that force the development team to cut out a lot of the puzzles and an entire third act of the game. And Zork Nemesis is such a joyless, dark, and serious game that it also doesn't really feel like Zork, which is known for its puckish sense of humor. Even so, it's a better made game than Return to Zork, and worth looking into if you enjoy Myst-style adventure gaming. The 1997 game Zork Grand Inquisitor takes place between Zork Nemesis and Return to Zork, and takes things in the other direction by trying to be funny. You play as a Froboz's vacuum cleaner salesperson named Afghancap, which is an acronym for Ageless, Faceless, Gender-Neutral, Culturally Ambiguous Adventure Person. One of your first tasks is to get a lamp, which becomes your guide and dungeon master narrator and is voiced by Michael McKean. You know, David St. Hubbins from This Is Spinal Tap, character actor in many great movies and TV shows, and more recently, Chuck McGill in Better Call Saul. He's actually a perfect choice for this game in terms of tone and style, and while I can't always say the game lands its attempts at humor, I do appreciate that it tries, because the plot this time is that the world is under the totalitarian rule of the Grand Inquisitor Yannick, and magic is outlawed, and some humor is needed in the face of all the blatant fascism. The characters are also a lot more fun this time around. There's an Indiana Jones-style character named Antharia Jack who gets hauled off by jackbooted Froboz's thugs early in the game. He's played by Dirk Benedict, the original Starbuck from Battlestar Galactica and Face from the A-Team, and he's really hamming it up in this game for comedic effect. There's also a sarcastic enchantress named Egale, a psychic named Lucy Flathead who beats Jack in a game of strip poker, a cowardly dragon named Griff, and a fairly stupid troll named Brog, who actually looks like a troll this time around instead of a guy in a bad costume. And you even get to play as some of these characters by entering time tunnels and visiting periods in the game's past. There are also a lot of references to Zork more broadly that will make series fans grin. Jack tells you he was involved in the Great Underground Adventure 4, which was a planned but unproduced Zork game. Some of the quest items you need are directly from other Zorks, including the Skull of Yorick and the fabled Coconut of Quindor. There's a throwaway line about how adventurers steal everything that's not nailed down, a major inside joke in the original Zork games. You'll of course visit the boarded up house and also see key items from other Zork adventures around the world, and there's even an Apple II style computer you come across that seems to be running Planetfall. And you'll see a similar screen pop up and detail your demise if you trigger a death sequence. As you might be able to tell, Zork Grand Inquisitor is a far better Zork game than its predecessors. It feels appropriately connected to the original games, strikes the same sort of tone, and has plenty of references and allusions without feeling like it's trying to recreate what came before it, and as an adventure game, yeah, it is actually pretty good. It's definitely more like Myst and the Seventh Guest than a Sierra-style point-and-click adventure due to its arbitrary puzzles and theme parkish emphasis on walking around pre-rendered environments looking for things to do, but it works. I'll even give props to the Grand Inquisitor Yannick himself, played by the character actor Eric Avari. He's a pompous and often amusing character who's way more fun than the actual villain of Zork Nemesis. If you're going to play any of the FMV Zork games, play Grand Inquisitor. It was the least popular of the three in terms of sales, but it's also the one you'll have the most fun playing. And speaking of the Zork games, there is another classic 1980 series that got its own FMV adventure game in 1996. It's called Nemesis: The Wizardry Adventure, though it's not tied to any of the other Wizardry games canonically. It's more like an Eye of the Beholder or Lands of Lore style adventure RPG with a fixed character and light combat, though it's cut closer to the cloth of Myst in terms of look and feel. Honestly, it is a decent hybrid of the two, with great-looking dungeons and some nice outdoor areas made with a combination of pre-rendered sprites and pre-rendered backgrounds blended together, sort of like Donkey Kong Country, but from a first-person, three-dimensional point of view. In 1996, 3D accelerator cards were still a fairly new idea, and most computers couldn't produce graphics like these on their own, so it was a neat trick, and Nemesis even has some places where your character is shown walking around in the world, or where you see transitions between screens as you move. It's not a consistent effect, and looks a bit clunky today, but it's honestly a lot less dated than the mainline Wizardry games tend to be. Myst inspired many other games that utilize pre-rendered backgrounds and rather passive adventuring, and I'm not even going to try to name them all. But one more we ought to cover is Starship Titanic, a much-hyped 1998 adventure game by the Digital Village, a developer in London co-founded by the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy creator Douglas Adams, along with his friend Robbie Stamp and a few other collaborators. And this game had the additional street cred of existing within the universe of Adams's books, since the Starship Titanic itself first appears in a footnote in the novel Life, the Universe, and Everything, and bears an early version of the infinite improbability drive. As we've discussed in previous episodes, Douglas Adams had a reputation for coming up with big ideas and not really seeing them through. And thankfully this time he was supported with a writing team including his friend and previous adventure game collaborator Michael Bywater, as well as D.A. Barham and Neil Richards. Terry Jones also had some involvement behind the scenes because he wound up writing the novelization of the game and voicing the parrot, a character whose voice will be immediately recognizable to any Monty Python fan, as will the voice of John Cleese, who you'll recognize as the Bomb. Having an entire team supporting seeing this game through helped, because it is ambitious, featuring a massive spaceship in which it is infinitely improbable that anything can possibly go wrong, and where, of course, things do immediately go wrong once the game starts and the ship crashes into your house. You're taken aboard and find it's filled with insane robots that you can speak to via a text input parser. So, the first thing to mention about Starship Titanic is that it's a really good-looking game, featuring an Art Deco aesthetic, neat-looking robots, great animations, and a smooth set of transitions between the various pre-rendered screens. It looks and feels a lot like a virtual reality game where your movement is confined to jumping between steps, and that's actually a compliment, since many Myst-style games don't have any transitions at all. The sound is also quite good, with a nice score and some excellent voice acting, including Douglas Adams himself composing some of the music and playing a couple of roles, the Suck You Bus delivery system robot, and the in-universe designer of the Starship Titanic, Leo Venice. All of this sounds great, but the problem is the game itself is not terribly entertaining. It's witty, but not particularly funny. And the puzzles are not that inspired or interesting, despite being insanely difficult in places. A puzzle near the end of the game requires you to use a photograph you've been holding since the beginning and some 3D glasses in the game's box. One puzzle even requires you to look at the back of the game box, which was an irritating idea in Metal Gear Solid, which came out the same year, and which is similarly annoying here. The text parser system doesn't work as well as it ought to, and it feels like a lot of effort went into giving the robots lines to spout, but not into being able to have an actual dialogue with the player, because the game's chatbot technology, much more along the lines of an Eliza bot than what we think of today, just wasn't up to the task. Much of what was planned for the game also doesn't seem to have made it into the final build. There are reportedly over 10,000 lines of dialogue in the game, comprising over 16 hours of audio recordings, for an adventure that you can beat in just a few hours. There were also two endings, one in which the ship blows up because you accidentally armed a bomb to make that happen, and one in which it doesn't, and you get to become its owner under the rules of Starship Salvage. Apparently, a third good ending was planned and is in the game's files, but didn't make it into the final version. That all suggests to me what I think a lot of people feel about Starship Titanic. It looks great at first blush, but the experience is undercooked overall. And that is a very interesting sentiment given that the game was in development for 2 years with a full-size team during a time where that was a very long and expensive development cycle. From all accounts, it wasn't Douglas Adams dropping out this time like he had on Infocom's Bureaucracy 10 years prior. He stayed involved with the game and apparently cared a lot about it. Rather, I think Douglas Adams and his team really, truly wanted it to be a groundbreaking game that just happened to be funny in a few places rather than a comedy game in the style of Myst. The ambitious design took precedence over the jokes, and even with some very funny people involved, it really does seem like a lot of the game's ideas got cut to the bone so Digital Village would have something to ship before they ran out of money. And so, I'll give Starship Titanic some credit for trying to go beyond what other adventure games were doing at the time. Unfortunately, it was considered a big flop, and the Digital Village never made another game. They transitioned instead into a sort of Wikipedia-style project called H2G2 that the BBC took over in 2001, which happened to be the same year Douglas Adams passed away. But one thing that did live on was the web forum for Starship Titanic, in which users spent years role-playing on the Starship Titanic construction internet as employees of Starstruck Incorporated, a wholly owned subsidiary of Starlight Lines Corporation. You gotta love it when fans keep something alive, and one of the game's developers, Yoz Graham, did too. He kept the fictional employee website going long after the official Starship Titanic site shut down. In the 1980s, arcades had a brief love affair with Laserdisc games, which allowed gamers to enjoy state-of-the-art interactive movie experiences featuring animation and full-motion video. The most famous of these, of course, was the 1983 hit Dragon's Lair, featuring lavish animation by Don Bluth. Several other Laserdisc games came and went over the years, including a Dragon's Lair sequel. Because the hardware was getting closer to being able to display fully animated graphics, personal computer users also got a third Dragon's Lair game that translated that cell animation into fluidly animated pixel art designed for a fairly short and unsatisfying personal computer experience that felt more like a tech demo because the storage limitations of the day prevented the game from looking and feeling quite like a Laserdisc title. But as multimedia computers equipped with CD-ROM drives began to become more common in the early to mid-1990s, the opportunity to create games using full-motion video was suddenly a reality. Myst, The Seventh Guest, and the Journeyman Project were among the first games to show how FMV could be integrated into conventional gameplay, but there was also a lot of buzz around making actual interactive movies that could allow players to experience filmed scenes that would vary depending on their choices. This design was particularly desirable because it would also work well on controller-driven console systems such as the Sega CD, 3DO, and CDI, broadening the player base. A few of the early games released in this format came from a developer called Digital Pictures, who'd originally built their games to run on an unreleased console called the Hasbro Control Vision, originally codenamed the Nemo. The idea of this console was that games would play on VHS tapes that allowed 4 video tracks to be played at one time. The game would allow players to switch between the different tracks to choose which parts of a story they'd like to view. The concept evolved from a murder mystery prototype into a horror game called Night Trap, which was filmed in 1987 and then designed for a planned release in 1989, along with another game called Sewer Shark that used the technology for a science fiction shooting gallery game. And both games wound up being shelved when Hasbro canceled the release of the Control Vision, later being retooled as launch titles for the North American launch of the Sega CD, which debuted in October of 1992. Night Trap is often referred to as the first interactive movie, but that's a dubious distinction depending on how you define the term. What you can say about Night Trap is that it was a lightning rod for controversy because its story involves a group of teenage girls spending a night in a wealthy family's estate and being preyed upon by goofy vampires called augurs. One scene features a girl named Lisa in a skimpy nightgown being ambushed by some augurs hiding in the bathroom and then carted off screaming as they drain the blood from her neck with a vacuum-like device. While very tame by the standards of R-rated B movies of the day, the suggestion that Night Trap might introduce young gamers to themes touching on sex and violence, during a time when video games like Mortal Kombat were allowing players to commit fatalities, created a national moral panic, directly leading to the creation of the ESRB and its rating system. I don't want to waste a lot of breath talking about Night Trap. It's a very dated game that isn't much fun to play today, beyond satisfying your curiosity. But it did introduce the world to the idea of the interactive movie adventure games that I do want to talk about, and we'll start with a couple of subjects we've already mentioned a few different times in this series. Viacom Simulations, the makers of the MacVenture adventure game series, and Sherlock Holmes, who appeared in a full-motion video series from 1991 to 1993 called Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. I'm not a huge fan of these games, and I honestly prefer the Lost Files of Sherlock Holmes, which we covered in our last episode. The premise is essentially the same as those home video games that you'd see in the late 1980s for VCRs. You watch some video scenes to learn about the case, you select some different actions from a menu to view clues or talk to witnesses, and you try to solve the case with the fewest actions possible to maximize your score. There's not a lot to do beyond watching video clips, though, and the games lose their replay value quickly because they're not very interactive. The technology was definitely exciting in the early 1990s as multimedia gaming was flashy and new, but the thrill wore off quickly as better adventure games began integrating FMV scenes. Even so, I don't want to make it sound like these games are bad. The production values are okay, and the acting is basically the sort of television quality stuff you'd see coming out of Britain in the 1980s and 90s, but unless you're really a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, and I am not, the appeal of the game is going to be in solving the 3 mysteries provided in each volume. Viacom Simulations published a similar game in 1993 called Dracula Unleashed that also made it onto the Sega CD, no doubt to take advantage of the popularity of the 1992 feature film Bram Stoker's Dracula. The game's premise is that it's a sequel to the novel where an American businessman named Alexander Morris is in London trying to learn about his brother Quincy's death. He connects with his brother's friend, Lord Arthur Holmwood, who invites him to join the secretive Hades Club. I won't say much more because the game's actually good enough that you should play it and explore its story for yourself, but I will comment that what could have been a very cheesy and uninteresting game turns out to be one of the better full-motion video adventures of the era. 1994 also saw the release of a cyberpunk full-motion video game called Burn Cycle, initially released for the CDI console and eventually ported to personal computers the next year. Without question, Burn Cycle is the best game on the CDI and a legitimately fun and decent full-motion video adventure game that also includes some action shooting gallery elements. The premise of the game is that you're a data thief who's picked up a neural virus infection that's about to destroy your brain. You have to find a cure by navigating the game's dystopian Blade Runner-style city and its cyberspace equivalent, the Televerse. The actors were filmed in front of a blue screen so that surreal computer graphics could appear behind them, and the game's over-the-top 1990s style is cheesy and fun without undercutting the game's story. People sometimes compare this game to the goofy 1995 film Johnny Mnemonic, but I actually think it's closer to the aesthetic of the TV show Max Headroom. And by the way, Johnny Mnemonic got its own FMV adventure game in 1995, which is like a basic cable production of the feature film starring different actors, including Julie Strain, the Queen of the B-movies, and Isaac Hayes, a musician and actor who was about to see his career get a second wind thanks to South Park, a comeback album, and revived interest in the theme to Shaft all that same year. It is not a good game by any means, but it is an interesting artifact of the era. 1994 also saw the release of Nickelodeon's Are You Afraid of the Dark? The Tale of Orpheo's Curse, an adventure game in the style of The Seventh Guest based on the television show about a group of kids called the Midnight Society who tell ghost stories to each other. The game represents the ghost story you're telling to the other kids, and that allows it to be a horror adventure without actually being that scary. Surprisingly, there's not a ton of FMV, but rather still photos featuring actors from the show along with a few video scenes here and there. As hokey as this game may seem, it's not a bad adventure, and it's an enjoyable way to spend a couple of hours, especially with kids who are interested in horror. In 1996, DreamWorks Interactive released a similar game called Goosebumps Escape from Horrorland, a far more sophisticated full-motion video horror experience featuring some Hollywood actors like Adam Wiley, Eric Lloyd, Isabella Rossellini, and Jeff Goldblum. The game's actually a sequel to the R.L. Stine Goosebumps young adult novel One Day at Horrorland, and while it's geared towards children, it's got a few tense moments and some wonderfully creepy scenes, and even some light combat to keep things interesting. A surprising amount of the game's footage is filmed and then set over some impressive 3D rendered backgrounds that have smooth video transitions between scenes. Once again, this one's a decent adventure that can be enjoyed in a couple of hours with your family. There's also a 1997 follow-up called Goosebumps Attack of the Mutant, but it's an action-adventure hybrid produced in a weird animated cel-shaded style that isn't too impressive today, and the game plays like a first-person shooter in many places where you can beat up enemies with your trusty rake or other weapons like ray guns or a paintball cannon. I personally find this game to be nightmare fuel due to its off-putting animation style and odd perspective where the characters are constantly looking down at you like you're a kid, but it does at least have Adam West in it playing a hero named the Galloping Gazelle and Jim Belushi as the Masked Mutant. A few other FMV games worth mentioning from the mid-1990s are the awkwardly named 1994 River Hill Soft game J.B. Harold Blues Chicago Blues, which continues the J.B. Harold Murder Club series, and the even more awkwardly named Interworks and Groyler Electronic Publishing game SFPD Homicide / Case File, The Body in the Bay. Both of these games are procedurals with investigation elements and a mixture of video footage and stills, and they're a decent time if you like detective-style games. But let me close out our discussion of the style of game with two that were published by Take-Two Interactive, Ripper and Black Dahlia. Ripper came out in 1996, and it's a cyberpunk adventure set in a dystopian New York City in the year 2040. And you know this game has some juice because its introductory cinematic is set to the classic rock song Don't Fear the Reaper by Blue Oyster Cult. It also stars Christopher Walken as Detective Vincent Magnotta, who sets the tone in one of the early scenes that this is going to be a game that's serious, full of grown-up language, and at times a little off-kilter. You play as a reporter named Jake Quinlan who's investigating the Ripper murders, which are brutal and mysterious, but which he discovers have a connection to a role-playing video game based on Jack the Ripper. Ripper is surprisingly good for such an oddball premise, and while it's a tad cheesy, especially when you enter the game's take on cyberspace, the graphics are good, the acting is decent, and the story is intriguing, with some interesting twists and turns. It's also surprisingly lengthy for an FMV game, spanning 6 CD-ROM discs, requiring many hours to get through and offering a few challenging puzzles and action sequences to pad things out. Take-Two's 1998 follow-up Black Dahlia takes place in the 1940s and is based on an actual historical event that took place in California involving the mysterious and unsolved murder of a woman named Elizabeth Short, who received the nickname the Black Dahlia after she died. The game doesn't follow the actual story too closely, which is just as well. Most of what was reported back in the day was speculative and intended to sell newspapers. The game also involves investigations into a real-life historical killer who perpetrated the Cleveland Torso murders before World War II, and this ties all together into a wild plot involving Nazis and the occult. I'll mention up front that Black Dahlia is a very good adventure game, often regarded as perhaps the last great FMV game of the era, and also one of the last great adventures in general before the genre went dormant. But man, is this game dark! It begins as a standard detective story in Cleveland, but there's a time jump about halfway through the game that takes you into the aftermath of World War II in Germany, where you pick up the trail of a case and find a mysterious gemstone called the Black Dahlia, and you uncover a trail leading to Elizabeth Short. The game doesn't allow you to change history to save her, though you definitely try, but it does provide an explanation for her murder, and man, does it result in one incredibly climactic ending. Black Dahlia is tremendously impressive as a work of interactive fiction. It's well written, has some excellent cinematography and acting, makes great use of its 1940s setting, particularly once you get to Hollywood in the latter half of the game, and even has some impressive props, costumes, and digital sets that fit the period appropriately. The puzzles feel fairly connected to the detective story and aren't nearly as arbitrary as some of those in other FMV games. And the entire adventure has an amazingly tense atmosphere thanks to its unsettling score and gradual cat-and-mouse dynamic that evolves with the game's psychopathic chief villain. When you have famous Hollywood actors like Dennis Hopper and Terry Garr in a game like this, and they don't even manage to steal every scene they're in, you know you have something special. And this game has dozens of actors in it who do a great job of playing their roles. It's not easy to play Black Dahlia today because it's stuck in copyright hell along with Ripper and Take-Two's hard-to-recommend 1994 FMV adventure Hell, a cyberpunk thriller, but it's definitely worth tracking down and playing through. It's even longer than Ripper and stretched across 8 CD-ROM discs, but You'll never forget it once you finish it. Just make sure you have a walkthrough handy. Some of those puzzles are brutal. We've talked about some great games in this episode, but I've saved some of the best for last. I've mentioned Legend Entertainment's Mission Critical and Access Software's Tex Murphy FMV adventures in previous episodes, but now we're going to finally talk through them a little bit, and I'm hopeful that once you hear about them, you'll be excited to give them a try if you haven't already. Mission Critical is a full-motion video science fiction game in the style of Star Trek, right down to the fact that Michael Dorn, who played Worf on Star Trek The Next Generation, is one of the actors in the game. But the game's story is definitely different from anything the Enterprise crew faced. You are the lone surviving crewman on an interstellar ship called the Lexington that was intended to escort a scientific vessel to investigate a mysterious alien artifact on the planet Persephone. Your faction, the Alliance Interstellar Space Operations Command, represents a variety of outer space colonies and a few allied nations on Earth and needs to retrieve this artifact to have a chance to fight back against the oppressive United Nations. And yes, in the 22nd century, the United Nations is a totalitarian Terran society that's up to no good. You have to bring the ship back online, reconnect with the Admiral in command, and then complete the mission, which involves fighting off pursuing forces with your ship's drones, piloting a lander to the surface, and locating the alien artifact. And this latter part is where the game gets a little jarring, because the first 2/3 of the game take place in pre-rendered settings, with lots of full-motion video sequences, but once you arrive on Persephone, some of the artwork is illustrated instead. I'm guessing Legend Entertainment ran out of time or money and had to insert some concept art to ship the game. But don't let that stop you from trying it out. Mission Critical is a very smart game with a good story, solid puzzles that suit the gameplay, and decent acting from both the on-screen actors and the voice actors. The game was created and written by Mike Verdu, the Legend Entertainment co-founder who also designed Frederick Pohl's Gateway and its sequel, and it's serious science fiction stuff with a high-concept story, a realistic understanding of how interstellar combat would actually work, and even a plausible rationale for a time loop that impacts the latter part of the game. My only real complaint is there's a long and very detailed info dump that occurs once you make contact with the beings guarded the artifact, and it goes on for nearly a half hour if you sit and listen to the whole thing. The game does very little to make this palatable, mostly showing an image of a sort of energy ball and alternating between male and female voices speaking in monotone. It's one hiccup in an otherwise intriguing and well-made adventure game. Speaking of science fiction, you might wonder if Star Wars and Star Trek had any FMV adventure games that made use of the film and television production happening in the late 1990s, and the answer is yes, but for Star Wars, there was Rebel Assault 2: The Hidden Empire, a game notable for getting Lucasfilm to dust off some of its old props and costumes and shoot some brand new scenes just for the game, but it's a rail shooter, not an adventure game. Likewise, the Star Wars Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight game has some full motion video and pre-rendered sequences, but it's a first-person shooter. Star Trek, on the other hand, had this 1996 interactive movie called Star Trek Borg, starring John Delancey, hamming it up as Q, and it's actually a fun and interesting interactive film that's well directed and which feels authentic to the Star Trek shows that were on TV in the mid-1990s. 1996 also saw the release of Star Trek Klingon, an immersive language lesson and voyage into Klingon culture, which was directed by Jonathan Frakes, best known for playing Commander William T. Riker on Star Trek The Next Generation. The game takes place on the holodeck with the Klingon Goran guiding you through things, and it's amazingly over the top with some of the greatest scenery chewing you'll ever see from a costume cast. The box also included an audiobook CD read by Michael Dorn and a 24-minute lesson called Power Klingon that even had a program using the Dragon System's speech recognition software to help users practice speaking in the Klingon language. Another example of Hollywood trying to get into the FMV adventure game genre included the 1996 Steven Spielberg's Director's Chair, in which you learn a little bit about how movies are made and get to do things like make your own movie poster, hear advice from your production staff, spend time in the editing bay, and add sound effects. You even get to splice together your own film from footage starring celebrities like Quentin Tarantino, Jennifer Aniston, and Penn and Teller. It's fun stuff, and it will actually teach you a bit about how things work behind the scenes on a movie production. And then there was Amazing Media's run of FMV games, starting with 1994's Wyatt Earp's Old West, which is more of an edutainment-style game to follow some other games like Space Shuttle, Capitol Hill, and Maniac Sports, and their amazingly goofy movie monster-style games like 1995's Frankenstein Through the Eyes of the Monster, which stars Tim Curry as Dr. Frankenstein, and 1996's Mummy, Tomb of the Pharaoh, which has no connection to the 1999 feature film, but which does star Malcolm McDowell, really giving it his all as the game's chief villain. This is the same year he returned to star as Admiral Tawin in Wing Commander 4: The Price of Freedom, by the way, so he must have really been enjoying being in video games at the time. But you know who else seems to have really enjoyed being in video games? Chris Jones, the face of Access Software's Tex Murphy, and also one of the chief designers behind Under a Killing Moon, a 1994 CD-ROM adventure game set in a sort of Blade Runner-ish dystopian future, but with its own sort of retro future hard-boiled detective style that definitely focuses on delivering a great adventure gaming experience every bit as good as anything Sierra or LucasArts created. This series was super popular in the 1990s among multimedia fans, and it has some pretty amazing production values, including the voice of James Earl Jones as a narrator known as the Great PI of the Universe, Margot Kidder from the Superman movies as the bartender, television and film actor Brian Keith as the Colonel, and the Lakota actor, musician, and activist Russell Means as Chameleon. But these celebrities support a frankly incredible cast of character actors who go out of their way to bring the world to life. And that's all the more impressive when you recognize that they were shot against a blue screen with almost all of the backgrounds and props being added in digitally with bitmapped renders. Unlike the pre-rendered scenes in many other FMV adventure games, the environments are actually run in a custom engine that looks surprisingly good for an era in which Doom was still considered state-of-the-art. Tex can also jump in his car and travel around old San Francisco, or what's left of it, following an apocalyptic event during World War III. This game definitely required a beast of a multimedia machine to run it well in 1994, and the sequels also stayed pretty close to the cutting edge as well. As a detective and part-time dance instructor Tex Murphy, you mainly gather clues through items and dialogue. Some puzzles also require you to assemble shredded documents or locate keys to open doors. As you explore, you'll often come across characters you can click on to trigger full-motion video sequences, and since many of them are mutants, there are a lot of crazy costumes and accents to keep the characters interesting. The plot of the game itself is actually the least interesting thing about Under a Killing Moon. If you find yourself invested in the story about a missing statue and an evil cult trying to wipe out mutant life with a space colony called the Moonchild, you're a better player than me. What I find intriguing about the game is its atmosphere. The world of Under a Killing Moon feels very detailed and lived in, and it's a lot of fun to explore and just chop it up with some of the game's many characters. Tex's personal problems are a lot more interesting to solve than the case itself, and the game's puzzles do a good job of making you feel like a detective who's stringing together a trail of cryptic clues in a situation where it's not really clear what Tex has gotten himself into. The next game in the series, 1996's The Pandora Directive, reuses a lot of the technology, locations, and characters from Under a Killing Moon, but it's a longer and more impressive experience that includes a more sophisticated story with a branching plot and different attitudes that Tex can adopt that are identified in the game through a metaphor known as Mission Street, Lombard Street, and the Boulevard of Broken Dreams. Basically, the high road, the typical Tex middle road, and the selfish jerk road. The game has 8 endings, 6 of which are unique, and 4 of which are reserved for the Boulevard of Broken Dreams path, and the game changes substantially in some places based on the path you take. It's a really clever way to get you to think about Tex's actions and encourage a little bit of role-playing to make the story feel more personal. Also, one of the endings has Tex quit being a PI and become a sad clown. You gotta love it. As in Under a Killing Moon, the overarching story of the Pandora Directive is probably the least interesting thing about it. The game's twisty-turny plot is constantly sending Tex in different directions and encouraging you to make choices that will ultimately shape his character and his love life. The story is ultimately about tracking down an alien spaceship connected to the Roswell incident in 1947, as well as the NSA's attempts to suppress Tex and the people involved in the case from finding it. The gameplay also offers an easier entertainment mode and a more fulfilling game players mode to allow players to determine whether or not they just want to play through the story or actually solve the puzzles. I love that it offers this because it gives the game some additional replay value for those who want to experience the story first and then go back and challenge themselves to get all the points and see all the endings. The next game in the series, 1998's Tex Murphy Overseer, is a remake of the 1989 point-and-click game Mean Streets and essentially has text retelling the story of that game, but with some differences here and there. It's a fun way to see the original game rendered in the new FMV style, and also to look back in time at new San Francisco when Tex had a nice office and took a job from his first client, Sylvia Linsky, who'd eventually go on to become his wife and then ex-wife. Overseer is not nearly as groundbreaking as the Pandora Directive, and it was actually intended to be the stopgap between that game and a sequel called Trance that Access Software never published. And actually, according to the series co-creator Aaron Connors, that might have even expanded out into 3 games called Chance, Polarity, and Trance. Unfortunately, Overseer became the last Tex Murphy game for the next decade and a half, and even worse, it ended on a cliffhanger. As adventure games go, Overseer is a fine experience. It's plenty of fun if you're invested in the world and the characters of the previous 2 games, but it's also a big letdown after the incredible experience the Pandora Directive provides. It's also the game with the best camera work, visual effects, acting, and detective story, playing much more like a full-on FMV game than a 3D game with FMV sequences. As such, I definitely recommend it, and it's a fine replacement for Mean Streets. As I mentioned, Tex Murphy fans had a long wait for another game. Several Access Software folks, including Chris Jones and Aaron Connors, eventually came back together under a new development studio called Big Finish Games and bought back the rights to the Tex Murphy series. They started teasing a new game called Project Fedora and eventually posted it up on Kickstarter in 2012, receiving enough backing to develop the concept into a 2014 game called Tesla Effect, a Tex Murphy adventure that continued the story of Overseer with Chris Jones once again stepping into the role of Tex. Unfortunately, there was such a gap between this game and the previous ones that the plot had to be advanced 7 years and put Tex into a sort of stranger in a strange land storyline where he's essentially an amnesiac trying to figure out what happened, but also getting caught up in a new web of intrigue. Many of the actors from the previous games returned to play characters, and Kevin Murphy of Mystery Science Theater 3000 and Riff Tracks plays your digital assistant Smart Alex. The new high-quality video and more modern 3D engine make the experience of returning to old San Francisco a lot of fun, and I'd suggest this game, like Overseer, is best appreciated by those who are really invested in the storyline of the characters. Like the Pandora Detective, there are some branching plot lines to explore, and the game's made with lots of obvious love for both the 1990s games and the fandom. Thankfully, it's a good stopping point for the story and also for our look at Tex Murphy. It doesn't look like we'll get any more Tex games soon, but for those who want more story, Aaron Connors has written 3 novelizations and 2 follow-up novels to pick up after Tesla Effect. And hey! There's also a game book called Tex Murphy and the Steakhouse Stakeout, an interactive adventure for those who really can't get enough. We've made it through the FMV era, but once again, we've barely scratched the surface. I have a long list of lesser-known games in the style of the ones we've been talking about that I'd love to delve into, but which I think you'll have much more fun exploring on your own. So you can head to greatestgames.substack.com and look at the show script for this episode to find these recommendations at the end, along with links to their Moby Games pages so you can learn more. We've still got to cover 3D games, interesting offshoots of the genre, and talk about LucasArts' evolution into multimedia and 3D. So we'll cover that in the next episode. I'm talking about games like Chronomaster, The Longest Journey, Bioforge, The Last Express, The Neverhood, Sanitarium, Twinson's Odyssey, Voodoo Kid, Grim Fandango, and Escape from Monkey Island. I also realize that a lot of our conversation is centered on the English-speaking world, and that's because I have a huge blind spot for Japanese adventure games since I don't speak or read the language. Fortunately, some of the best Japanese adventures got ported over to consoles and translated into English, so we can talk about them along with other adventure games that are console exclusive in an upcoming episode as well. So we're going to flip then to consoles and handhelds to talk about games like Policenauts, Nightshade, The Space Adventure, Mansion of Hidden Souls, D, Pac-Man 2, The New Adventures, Blazing Dragons, Scooby-Doo Mystery, Policenauts, Zack and Wiki, Quest for Barbarossa's Treasure, Swagman, Steins Gate, Clannad, and Moon. And if we have time, we may even delve into the incredible Sakura Taisen series, find a Zero Escape sort of dilemma, or spend some time righting wrongs in the turnabout courtroom with an ace attorney on the rise. Then we'll finally close by touching on the 21st century contributions of studios like Telltale Games, Double Fine, Daedalic Entertainment, Amanita Designs, Wajidai Games, and Quantic Dream. I honestly don't know how we're going to fit it all in. If you enjoy this show, you can read this series every week on my Substack at greatestgames.substack.com, where you'll also find brand new articles on other great games you've never played. And you're always welcome to talk with me on Bluesky. I'm Sean Jordan, I am your Great Game Guide, and I'll be back next week with more to explore. Before I let you go every week, I close out the show with a game I want you to try that's a little off the beaten path. This isn't sponsored content, and I don't have any financial stake in anything I recommend. These are games that I think are really good, but don't have as much exposure as some of the more popular ones. This week, I'm recommending Dunk Dunk by Platonic Friends and published by Badge Hammer Limited. It's a strange fusion of NBA Jam and competitive indie games like Nidhogg 2, where you can create your own characters from different body parts, and while it might not look like much at first, this game truly has the juice to be a great local co-op or competitive experience. The basic idea of the game is that you're playing a 2D platformer take on basketball with either 1v1 or 2v2 matchups. Your characters have really long arms you can swing around to dunk, but they can also transform into long platforms to block other players from getting the ball into the goal. And while you can also shoot the ball, it's very easy for other players to steal it, encouraging both sides to try to keep possession as long as possible and make that dunk. The game has a surprising amount of customization options and modifiers to keep things fresh, and it's super easy to pick up and play. I'm honestly surprised it's not getting more attention because it's a tremendously fun game and provides an excellent couch co-op experience. I got Dunk Dunk for a couple of bucks in a game bundle, but even at its full asking price of $7, it's a great deal and even includes a crossover with the Plucky Squire, as well as other indie games like Demon Turf. If you like those games, you'll like this one too. The Great Game Guide is a podcast written by me, Sean Jordan, and I also wrote the theme music. This is all 100% human-created content. I don't use AI for any part of my production. This episode is copyright 2026 by me, Sean J. Jordan, and you can find more details in the show notes and on my website at greatestgames.substack.com. And credit where it's due. Any games, artwork, sources, or additional music are the property of their respective owners, used under fair use guidelines and also noted in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please let me know on Substack, Bluesky, or with a nice review. But I'd appreciate it even more if you'd share it with a like-minded friend. Thanks for listening!